Dr. Claudia Cotca from Washington, D.C., founder and CEO of Global Leadership, Dentistry and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to our November 2nd symposium. I'd like to first invite Christa Serban to the podium and have her make some introductions as well as just housekeeping items briefly. Of course, we welcome everyone to today's webinar, and if you're not able to be here, it is accessible via the YouTube channel for Global Leadership in Dentistry and Sciences. So with that, I'd like to invite our Global Ambassador, Christa Serban, and DMD candidate, as well as intern for Washington Institute for Dentistry and Laser Surgery here in Washington, D.C., USA Metro.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GLDS Symposium. It's our 8th symposium so far, and today's symposium will be on regulatory policies. And GLDS founder and CEO Claudia C Cotca will be presenting on updates on the regulatory sector for global dental leaders. Professor Claudia Cotca, DDS MPH, is an internationally recognized lecturer, USA expert with ADA, SCDP, AAMI, ANSI, ISO, IEC, ITU, AFDO, healthcare analyst, dentist, toxicologist, and founder of various private and public health ventures with expertise in innovation of clinical protocols, medical devices, global laser technology, clinical applications, and oral systemic axes, global healthcare intelligence, healthcare policy, and expert witness before USA Congress and White House. She is appointed at rank of professor at Liberty University, School of Health Sciences, and international research collaborator with the Dental Research Center using conventional and alternative technologies, Victor Babeș University of Medicine and Pharmacy, Timișoara, Romania. Thank you so much, everyone, who is joining us at the symposium, and please enjoy the symposium on regulatory subsector updates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christa. Thank you again, and congratulations for the excellent leadership and continued leadership and support to our ambassador, GLDS ambassadors all over the world. As you all know, we have over 70 countries being represented, and of course, it's an ongoing effort, and we really wish to excel in representing the knowledge and the most altruistic logic of collated elements of thought, as it, of course, it relates to subject matter in healthcare commodity space. And my thought, as well as with others, is that the subject matter experts ought to be a leader in the contribution and direct distribution of expert opinion, specifically in the healthcare commodity space, and irrespective of geoposition and the heterogeneity of those nuances that the geoposition, of course, brings to the table. The leadership requirements of interacting, of course, are always unique and always required. So with that, I'd like to, again, welcome everyone. If we, of course, some of us are all over the world, you're extended throughout our zone times, and we appreciate your collaborations, and I know that you're working incredibly committedly, as well as with great deal of efforts and at different speeds as the platform, of course, recommends, because we essentially are training leaders as subject matter experts in leadership positions and with leadership profiles and with leadership skills in that capacity of representation in the trigonometry of intersecting with other leaders in the commodity space or the participants of the healthcare commodity space all over the world. That said, just some disclosures. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., USA, affiliations with various different references and ventures and institutes, as already was mentioned. Of course, videography and photography is by permission. And with that, I'd like to jump in specifically on today's objectives of focusing on the regulatory aspect. And so coming to you, of course, as you all are clinicians and some scientists and some both, we're going to identify what is really the regulatory policy subsector, what's the functionality, what are the sector participants, or what do they, how do they manifest, and what's the formula or the format in which recognition ought to be ignited, and of course the requirements of the transaction and past, present, and future commentaries. I like to just remind you that we are at the beginning, essentially, a series of the more basic fundamentals elements and the propositions of those elements with the additive and synergistic contribution potential or capacity. So some of these symposiums will be more macro view with some examples of micro, but there will be subsequent diving of very specific into being much more comprehensive in and remunerating, of course, the comprehensive reference of each component, which constitutes the subsector subsector reference. So today, as already mentioned, looking at the past symposiums, of course, incorporate all the different subsectors. They should be mentioned here as well for those of you who are joining us de novo. And from, of course, comprises 360 Healthcare comprises of public health and private clinicians and scientists, experts. So they're subject matter experts. And in order for the true discipline of having true access or I would say ability to make recommendations and contributions and impact in the most effective and efficient way possible in the public sphere, irrespective of what level, vertical or horizontal, experts really need to be involved and be designated as the leaders of the profession, as they are. In certain segments of the globe, there's open markets versus closed markets, or somewhere in between. Of course, some of those markets will allow for self-autonomy composition, and there's always a flux in terms of the configuration by definition, but also the implementation capabilities of that. And of course, commenting on the rest of the participants, and we're going to dig in specifically on regulatory, includes, of course, academia. You have the R&D, the industry, the legislation, government aspects, subsectors, of course, the business side, including financials, of course, and financial vehicles, which tend to be now the highest pressure points in the most recent years. And I can, we'll comment on that in the subsequent lecture. The consumer platforms, the media, and of course, the legal subsector. The regulatory aspect, and when we think of regulatory, there's actually several different, it has a very heterogeneous type of reach, and sometimes some of these sectors or subsectors have encompassed by functionality and potential. For instance, technology has a certain implementation capacity for the dialect of impacting output, the end user impact as well as the end user receiver. And so from a regulatory perspective, it is considered a standard of practice by the subject matter expert. And that's really when we look at standards, industry standards, right? And we look at professional standards. But on the other hand, it also serves as an oversight, essentially a overreaching evaluation of the landscape in practical terms, but keeping in mind the theoretical logistics of evaluation and qualification and quantification of those particular elements of the metrics that comprise the particular subject matter. And so in the United States, even though I've dealt into the regulatory market for the past 15 plus years here from the United States globally, I will specifically give examples in this particular lecture with some tangents, but mostly we'll reference the USA market or the USA model. In the United States, the oversight component comes from a more respected legislative distribution of compositions, if you will, or of impact, coming, of course, from the federal, state, and local side, but also coming from the private organizations, such as, expert opinion, subject matter clinicians, which are, of course, comprising a particular medical discipline or dental discipline, which, of course, form and are able to achieve and able to represent officially and formally as a self-autonomous profession or self-autonomous body that actually is given the priority of of the superlative of impact and definition when it comes to to those type of to that type of I would say opportunity for impact. Now that said, excuse me, so we're going to dig now a little bit more specifically in the regulatory vertical, if you will. So you will have clinicians, of course, and from an expert's perspective, there's the private sector, there's the private health component, and the other subsectors. But specifically on regulatory, you have the patent trademark office in the United States, you have the FDA, CDC, NIST as a body, ISO, IEC, and ITU are international out of Geneva. Now, some of those will specifically either be formulated and designated as regulatory bodies, and others will be coming from an oversight perspective or impact, and there is a very, very fine coordination of the regulatory players. This is not an exhaustive list. It was just an example. For instance, other private organizations, which I mentioned, which oftentimes private organization will influence the governmental organizations, even though from a legislative perspective, regulatory perspective, the government is involved in the distribution requirements, etc. But it is, for instance, has a very special conduit of combination or working with or directives from the actual private organizations such as medicine and dentistry. In the United States, by legislation, medical and dental personnel and mental health clinicians actually are first-tier private first responders. And so no one takes precedence over that by law. Now, in the practical sense, for instance, there's going to be, there can be a lot of shuffling or ignoring or violation of that law, but nevertheless, coming from the regulatory perspective to a legislative arm, this is that transition. And so understanding, much like we have to understand the historic profile of a patient from a systemic aspect and medical history aspect, and understanding that landscape propels a more appropriate and an accurate assessment of the opportunity for etiologic diagnosis and a cause mechanism sense of diagnosis, much like the clinical thought process or the interest. Same thing occurs when we look at to transact and to have a discourse, on or contributions in terms of the proliferative impacts in the geoposition or in the region, or of course collaborative geopositions. And so the healthcare system, for instance, in the United States are comprised of doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, but also can be comprised of private sector, small business, brick and mortar, if you will, type of entities. The subject matter disciplines will also have their own representation, as mentioned. And of course, we also have, for instance, examples as the medical academia accreditation bodies, their licensure bodies, certification bodies, all of which, of course, in the United States really take their leadership from the subject matter. Now, in certain other geoposition may not necessarily have the same combination or the same profile, or at least the distribution pattern is not, may not be in the same directives. Of note, new inventions, for instance, which unlike, for instance, I would say the predominant thought is that most inventions occur really in academic settings because of the research and development that occurs. And again, coming from the USA model, that's the perception. However, the most innovation-driven opportunities really are in other sector or in other elements and other verticals of the participants, and I'll comment in just a little bit. The innovations, for instance, requirements include, of course, patents, but also can be trade secret and other strategies, and of course would go through an FDA or an NDA aspect of sequence, which, of course, every entity, academia, the industry, the private care practice, the small business, or the small practice in the private sector, clinician, one or two clinicians or a group practice, will also parlay the same or nuance of fluctuations or derivations that are, of course, within the same recognition and value-based proposition in terms of regulatory response, but also will have a different navigation opportunity. And this is where you get a lot of creativity and innovation potential, because smaller bodies, of course, are going to be able to move quicker and faster and more creative than larger bodies like the Titanic. That said, what I like you to keep in mind as healthcare experts, particularly as clinicians and scientists, is when we look at the regulatory, various different regulatory bodies with more jurisdiction or less jurisdiction from a legislative perspective or an organizational or an oversight perspective. And there are others, for instance, like in conjunction with this, the American Dental Association has, for instance, a body of regulatory representation on dentistry. And it was their initiatives that actually brought the more specific. And so it serves as a way of decisive recognition of responsibility to actually bring together the subject matter to the table without being asked. And the initiatives that comes from the logic or theoretical composition of the science or of the discipline is always a requirement for more profound and responsible action, of course, with the higher degree of potentiated output, which when you go through further clinical renditions, you're going to see that private health, I've always argued, is public health. And this is really where the rendition occurs. But looking at the XYZ axis that I mentioned, for instance, subsequent lectures, when we look at the macro scales, right, on the y-axis, and the axis is having the concept logic data, the z-axis in the particular sense from a regulatory perspective analysis would be a depth with respect to, for instance, the differentiation of clinical protocol versus medical devices and their intersects. By that, I mean is that, for instance, sometimes clinical protocols are matched incorrectly with the medical device, or the medical device, for instance, have different technological output potentials, but the FDA, for instance, clearance was only done for a particular component. And this is where we're going to be diving in more specifically in subsequent symposium to actually understand where the potentiated prospect is and why is it important for me as a clinician. As a clinician, we actually have much more impact in terms of the innovation aspect, not just about the transfer of the commodity, meaning the service, the therapeutics, what we have learned at school, but also the innovation capability. And I will now go specifically on that when we were talking about earlier toxicity indexes. When we look at, for instance, advanced oral systemic clinical protocols, when we look at the balance between therapeutics and therapeutics index and toxicity index, which basically is the battle of the fittest, right? We want to minimize a toxicity index for a medical device, for a clinical protocol, and we want to maximize the therapeutic index for the same. The aspect of regulatory policies or regulatory impact or regulatory oversight or even regulatory requirements for competition or for distribution of concepts comes in various different forms. One is, for instance, a label or versus a labeling. And when we look at the general sense, we look, of course, in vitro diagnostics. These are the aspects where the labeling or labels would have an impact, and it has to be precise based on the regulatory requirements. This is coming from the FDA, for example, but it's not the only breadth of scope of reach or incorporation, although, albeit, the clinician really has the unique opportunity to actually be very customized. And I'll go into that in just a little bit in a few slides. But looking from the general sense, we're looking at the application would be obviously to in vitro diagnostics, investigational devices, which are different than unique device identifications, or, for instance, good manufacturing practices, which are not requirements, but they're suggestions. But there's an inference, and of course, general electronic products implementation or requisition. And experts, as you can see here, are very important to participate in the regulatory aspect, even though they really, the radius of engagement walks away from the immediate practice and the immediate academic or the typical engagement of forum of discussions and contributions for the typical clinician or the typical scientist. But you can see very obviously how impactful these particular renditions can be. And if they're not, for instance, present in a geo position, there is, of course, argument for opportunities to have the composition be present so that the impactful nuance of rendition of impact at the right time, of course, will then obviously reduce comorbidities with time. And this is where I like to just highlight how does this regulatory, and again, I took a very thin slice of this, so bear in mind, in terms of the application for us as clinicians and scientists. I consider myself a scientist as much as a clinician, as well as a public health expert because of my toxicology and public health credentials and training. However, the extension based on the training and the credentials is not just I would say a stop point of limitations, but rather the logic of the science or the discipline will actually argue for itself that the correct disease assessment approach ought to be recognized, meaning as oral systemic mechanism. Then of course the identification of technology, and this is where the policy of regulatory has more impact. On the disease assessment side, the impact comes more from the academic licensure, the academic testing, and other types of self-autonomous directives from the specialists or from the specific experts in disciplines. Now, when we look further at increasing the clinical outcome, not just for our patients, right, but for the geoposition at large, now we come into differentiated phenotypes, right? A certain geoposition will render different phenotypes, another geoposition by and large, and will probably isolate for a particular type of phenotypic manifestation of abnormality, which in other geoposition just doesn't exist or is easily controlled and eliminated. Now, in choosing clinical protocols, in choosing medical devices, the regulatory aspect is absolutely crucial just because it has a lot of intersects, perhaps more than other subsector elements that I've mentioned, but it really is impactful in the sense of protecting longitudinally for the stability of population health and, of course, specifically for reducing comorbidities. And this is where that aspect of private health is public health, and, of course, the private health sector. So private health sector, I'm going to repeat that, private health sector, and that can be in academia, which is private, or the private clinicians, brick and mortar, one office or one provider offices, or community health interactive offices in oral systemic, but from a private health perspective, private sector perspective, as opposed to public health sector, which of course the participants, the nomenclature, as well as the vehicle of manifestation is going to be different, but there is a continuity and there's an interaction. And the United States model, the best way to describe it is really to have a two-wheel gamut of intersection. And we're going to go a little bit more further in that. So now, as we go to the verticals or horizontals of the 360 healthcare perspective, when we look at oral systemic, advanced oral systemic clinical protocols development, coming from the regulatory, and of course we are clinicians, so we have a real-time opportunity, and we'll go into more specific details as subsequent times for us in other symposiums. But again, looking at the differentiation or optimization of medical devices, the clinical protocol, particularly the precision medicine, which is basically the clinician implemented. And again, the precision medicine has been misutilized and misappropriated across the board, across, I would say, globally. We'll come back to later on that. But looking at the therapeutic toxicity indices and that delta is going to have direct impact on the regulatory potential of implementation and restrictions. And the one thing I have to say is that in general, we do not want to restrict beyond flexure point of breakage. And that serves well in terms of the physics, of course, and engineers understand that it actually is applicable in all the other, practices and principles, including the practice of medicine, including the innovation aspect. And so the geoposition will have impact on the players at hand. And as a clinician, and a subject matter expert, if you wish to impact and you wish to represent your profession effectively and efficiently in working on contributions with other segments of the healthcare commodity space, that would like to have an impact in this space or like to transact in this space, inevitably the consumer is effective as well as the clinician is effective, and every other participant is affected. The recognition of the metrics requirements of elements and the logic implemented, meaning a macro view and coming into a micro view, is absolutely a requirement. This is where the leadership skill set that GLDS provides come into absolute unique contributions and accessibility, obviously to various projects opportunities, but also from direct knowledge and direct sharing of experience and well-versed journeying into that. So that said, again, looking from the oral systemic protocols of evaluation, either single axis or multi-axis aspect, and of course, there are situations where we want to protect a vitality, and we have to have a very limited time of frame of action to stabilize a patient. But most of the cases are not along those lines. So when we look at clinical protocols, the industry, meaning technology development, and again, they can occur into private practice, or it can occur into major manufacturing aspects or facilities or ventures, as well as in the academia or other types of enterprises. Now coming from the technology side, of course, and consumer platforms, which has not been present before. And looking at the mechanism and differential diagnosis delta, take that to the legislation policy, the academic R&D contributions and distribution, but specifically in terms of wheeling in with the regulatory aspects, which obviously comes from the FDA for medical devices, standards, industry, from device manufacturings and applications. But again, differentiate between innovation opportunities, testing modalities, unique devices as opposed to specific aspects. And this is where I think the flexibility of a large body is absolutely necessary, including flexibility from the FDA or other large regulatory bodies. And I mentioned ANSI, of course, because NIST although it's not a regulatory body, it is a comprised representation of the of standards, of industry standards, that basically in order to compete, one resolves to incorporate those standards, because obviously when the open market is accessible to the client will choose the best output potential. And so allowing for the competition edge is very different than a different market, economic market platform or composition. And that, of course, has intricate impact. For instance, CDC for the last 18 or even more years, decades, have, unlike the last few years, has always been a database of aggregates of data, simply collecting data and simply sharing the data in raw form in terms of the population findings, in terms of incidence and prevalence, and understanding, for instance, with respect to where the phenotypes are distributed, what are the mutations rates in the population on a particular enzyme like CYP450, etc. And that really is another example that just pairs up with other entities that are partaking in the regulatory side. And then, of course, we have the private sector aspect, the private sector organizations that come from entities like ADA or AMI, for instance, that focuses on instrumentation, the Advancement for Medical Instrumentation, and I'm also involved with them. So that said, just to wrap up on the 360 healthcare coordination from a regulatory perspective, I'd like to again make a case for the fact that the macro-micro scale on the y-axis, if you will, is going to give that fluctuate inside view based on the requirement at hand, but not withholding the perception or the sensitivity that concept, logic, and data is incorporated into that particular affluence or position, even though it may not be necessarily impactful or observed at that time, but it could be up and coming, or it was historic. And then the other, of course, from a Z-axis perspective, coming in with the clinical protocols, dance, if you will, with the technology and medical device development and presence. And so those are modifications that actually play significantly in the regulatory space. So that said, we're coming to a close here. I think I went a little bit further than I had planned in terms of the specifics, because it's very exciting, of course, understanding those elements, and of course, particularly about the implementation aspect. But I hope this gave you a broad understanding of, first of all, what the regulatory policy subsector's function is, what the regulatory policy subsector participants are, and of course, this was not an exhaustive list, and of course, the requirements of the subsector in terms of the interaction. And of course, that's going to be much more elaborately presented in future symposiums. And so this has been really the past. Understanding the past actually is equally important as the opportunity to impact the present for future. That said, again, I'm going to go to the analogy between the correlation and the, not just correlation, but the cause and effect component in terms of the historic medical history of an individual, of a patient. That's very, very unique, very important to understand, very important to be understood and to know and to have comprehensive details, so that the most optimal logic is applied to the data presented in the chief medical complaint that we as clinicians or sometimes scientists are faced with. And so where we go from here very much takes in consideration where the past is. Certain geopositions will have different paths and different history trajectories than others. And the logic of understanding those nuances is crucial in order to have present, for instance, impact or even future potentiated capacity. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for your attention. As usual, of course, I'd like to congratulate all the GLDS ambassadors, the members, those who actually represent our profession, and of course, both scientists as well as clinicians in the dental space, as well as the medical and healthcare space. And our ambassadors, I'm very impressed and encouraged to see that there are very active arms of contributions and, of course, interest and collaboration, so that we can optimize clinical output for our patients through the variety and garden variety of impacts. And of course, I'd like to congratulate Christa Serban again for her leadership and excellence and commitment and support, and congratulate each one of you as GLDS ambassadors. And so with that, I'd like to say warm and best regards and success from Washington, D.C.